people are familiar with a product called Roundup, which is manufactured by Monsanto. It is used widely on crops as an herbicide that controls broadleaf weeds and grasses. It is also commonly used as a lawn and garden product and has been registered as a pesticide in the United States since 1974. Glyphosate is the key chemical compound in Roundup. Most people by now have heard various advertisements about lawsuits surrounding the use of products containing glyphosate. However, many people are still unaware of its impact. So on today's show, I'm going to talk to Dr. Chadi Nabhan about his new book, Toxic Exposure, the true story behind Monsanto trials and the search for justice. So I'd like to welcome to the show, Dr. Nabhan. Welcome.
June, thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I don't know if you could see this. This is, camera's not that great, but this is my book.
I'll do it for you. There you go.
There you go. And let me tell you something. Thank you for everything that you've been through, all of your education, your family's support, all that you put up with to be able to write this book. This book is really putting something in black and white that should have been in black and white for many years. So I thank you on behalf of many people. And I'm just so delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you.
You're welcome. It's really my privilege and my honor to be on your show. Thank you.
Before we begin, I'd just like to give a shout out to Dr. Rosemary Mason, who has been a dear friend for many, many years, who had suggested your work to me. And I'm very grateful. So I just wanted to mention her. Now, before we begin, can you share with our listeners a little bit about your background, especially your expertise?
So I'm a medical oncologist and a hematologist. I am board certified in hematology, oncology, and in internal medicine. And I practiced oncology and hematology for a long time at large healthcare systems and at large academic centers as well. And then subsequently, I took on various administrative and research roles as chief medical officer and other roles. But in my area of expertise is essentially non-Hodgkin lymphoma and Hodgkin lymphoma, so all lymphoid malignancies when it comes to taking care of patients, conducting research, doing clinical trials. I'm also very interested actually in real world evidence and real world data because there's a lot of things that occur when it comes to patient care that are different in the real world than clinical trials. Clinical trials usually enroll patients who are fit, who are vigorous, who have the resources, and that doesn't always happen in real world. So I'm very interested in patterns of care and how patients are cared for in the real world. But my research interest and expertise has been in non-Hodgkin lymphoma and lymphoid malignancies, and I believe that's why I was called on by the legal firms to look into the Monsanto, Roundup, and non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Could you explain for our listeners that are unaware of what exactly is non-Hodgkin lymphoma and what the ailments are, what people experience?
Yeah, so it's a form of cancer. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma is a form of cancer. It generally involves the lymph glands that we have in our body. Sometimes it involves the bone marrow, which is the factory that produces red cells, white cells, and platelets inside to the bloodstream. Sometimes it involves both and that. But there are so many types of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. There are almost 60 types of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So just because there's a growth or a tumor or a cancer in the lymph node and you think it's non-Hodgkin lymphoma, it doesn't mean you know the subtype of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So oftentimes the differences between these various types of non-Hodgkin lymphoma dictate the prognosis, the treatment, and what we would usually do. But it's a form of cancer. It involves these lymph glands. As you know, sometimes you can feel your lymph glands. You can feel your lymph glands in your neck, in your armpits, in the groin, but there are lymph glands that you can't feel inside the abdomen or in certain organs you just don't have access to feel on your own. So, but this is really what it is. And cancer is really overgrowth of cells. So usually our cells should live in harmony. They usually live, they have a lifespan, and then they die, and new cells usually evolve. But somehow that balance is um, is distorted, and the cells either grow and multiply and don't die, and that leads to tumors, and eventually these could become cancers. So I hope this simplifies things to your listeners as to what non-Hodgkin lymphoma is, but I want to emphasize that there are so many types of that non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and the only way to differentiate between these types is by looking under the microscope, doing some sophisticated studies, staining studies, chromosomal studies, molecular studies, to know which type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma we are dealing with.
Thank you. Now, when it came to getting involved with the litigation, how did you get involved with this whole thing? Who approached you?
I got a call from a couple of lawyers from the Miller firm. The Miller firm is a law firm in Virginia that has been established and led by the late Mike Miller, who is an amazing man, an amazing, courageous lawyer. And I had two lawyers from that firm contact me. I believe that, again, they were given my name by some people that they knew as someone who has an expertise in non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And I've taken lawyer calls before, but I really never wanted to be an expert witness. I've gotten called a lot to look into malpractice cases. I just never really wanted to do that. Didn't have the bandwidth and never liked the idea of testifying against other physicians. But this was different. I got called by these two lawyers, and they said, we are looking for you to provide us with an opinion about the relationship between Roundup and non-Hodgkin lymphoma, because we represent some patients who allege that they were diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma because of their heavy exposure to Roundup, the herbicide that you mentioned earlier on. And I told them, I said, I'm familiar with the risk between pesticides in general as a category and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. I know of data that farmers have higher risk of developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma than non-farmers, but I was not, frankly, aware of the detail that are related to Roundup to non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and I said that. And they said, that's fine, but if you're willing to look into it and do your research and let us know, we're more than happy to learn from you. And I Googled Roundup, and I realized how ubiquitous it was and how just, everybody is using it as a weed killers. And I thought to myself, maybe I should just at least do some research on it, because the impact of what I may find could be really pretty big if indeed there's that relationship between Roundup and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And I did that, and several months later, I was, I was able to I was convinced that there is a relationship between Roundup and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And then after that, when I talked to the lawyers, they sent me additional information that were pulled through discovery after signing some confidential documents. And I said, I am willing to go ahead and help with this and see where we go from here. But I had no idea what the impact is going to be. I didn't even know how big this is going to be, but that's how it all started. It was the spring of 2016. Almost, I can't believe this. It's 7 years ago now.
Yeah, it's amazing that so much progress is made actually, with regards to the research, you cited some information that you found from Swedish scientists, that they kept a database of people who had cancer, correct? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll talk about this. The one thing I want to make sure that people know, as somebody who practiced oncology for 20 years and saw a lot of patients, it is important to know that science in general is never 100% perfect. So there's a lot of nuance to scientific articles and scientific research and taking care of patients. But despite that, we must be able to take care of patients and provide counseling and advice despite the imperfection of science. So as I was starting doing the research, a lot of the research was centered on epidemiological human studies. Epidemiological studies, basically, you are looking at the prevalence of a particular problem in a population. And Sweden is interesting because they have a registry for patients with cancer. So patients who get diagnosed with cancer, they are entered into the registry, and you're able to tell some information about them, sometimes about the stage, about where they live, and other things pertaining to what's going on there. And you're able to do what we call case control studies, where you can actually look, for example, at certain patients who were diagnosed with lymphoma and other patients who were not diagnosed with lymphoma, and ask questions to these both populations to try to understand what they were exposed to and what they were not exposed to, and then do some statistical modeling to reach a conclusion whether these who were diagnosed with lymphoma had some form of exposure, more exposure to certain hazards or compounds that the people who were not diagnosed with lymphoma did not have. So because of the way the registry in Sweden is organized, it made it a fertile ground to do a lot of studies trying to look at these relationships between exposures and particular ailments and diseases. And in the late 90s, some papers started to surface from Sweden looking at that patients who were exposed to glyphosate appear to have more incidence of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which is the form of cancer that we just discussed. And subsequent studies led to the fact that the more exposure you have to this particular herbicide, the more likely you are going to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So that's really where I believe the Swedes were helpful. And there are other studies that came from outside Sweden, from the US, from Canada, and others. But I really believe that the first tip came from Sweden in papers in the late 90s.
It's interesting. The late Dr. Henk Tennekes, he was the Dutch toxicologist that blew the whistle on neonicotinoids. He had done some research on what is referred to as the dose-time ratio, in which basically what it boils down to is once a certain dosage has been reached, death is imminent. And it's interesting because it's similar to what you're talking about. And the evidence just keeps mounting. There's so much evidence out there. And I would like to just stress something, the importance of peer-reviewed science. From what my experience has been, when science has been independently conducted, peer-reviewed, and published, it's the most credible. And from what I read in the book, Monsanto was pushing research that was not the case. It was not peer-reviewed. Why do you think they would be pushing that?
I think there are some studies, and this came up in my first deposition on general causation. I believe this was in August 2017, something like that. But there were some studies that Monsanto alleged they actually submitted to the the EPA, and to other regulatory authorities, but they were not really peer-reviewed because they were registration studies and they were considered trade secrets. With the idea that if we are going to publish these, and we are going to put these out there, this might actually be trade secrets, and other companies might actually steal this information from us. That did not resonate with me because I felt if you really, every single thing that is at least, you want to have things reviewed by others to gain more credibility. But I think they alleged that some studies did not need to be reviewed, and maybe this is the law, I guess. Again, maybe this is what the EPA does not demand every single study that is submitted to be peer reviewed, and that's fine. If that is I don't make the regulations or the laws, but I'm speaking as a physician, as a clinician, and as a researcher. And to me, what speaks more is peer-reviewed literature. Now, having said that, June, I do also think it's important to do your independent research and evaluation of the papers, because remember, there's always a way that you can actually sway. There's always a journal for any paper that you want to publish. There's a lot of journals out there, And just because a paper is published somewhere, and just because a paper has been peer reviewed and published, does not mean that this becomes the Bible of all studies. I mean, in fact, as you know, Monsanto always liked a study called the Agricultural Health Study, the AHS. The Agricultural Health Study was published and peer reviewed in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, the JNCI. And I think it's a study that was meaning well. They were trying to actually do a well for the study, but I don't really think that the study was well done. And I think there's a lot of confounders, and the outcomes of the study were not something I actually agree with. So there are two issues here. Not every peer-reviewed study in every journal we're going to take at face value, because if we do this, then we have to take every paper that was published in favor of Roundup as it's great. And not every paper, and we still have to publish them. So we have to really do independent evaluation, research, and have our critical thinking. It's important to really have critical thinking as we evaluate the evidence and agree that sometimes things are not perfect. Despite these imperfections, we have patients at hand, and we need to make sure we counsel them and provide them with the advice that they trusted us in.
Thank you. Let's talk briefly about Mr. Johnson. Can you share with our listeners about his situation?
Mr. Johnson was the first patient plaintiff that sued Monsanto for him developing non-Hodgkin lymphoma because of his heavy exposure to a Roundup compound. His was called Ranger Pro, which has glyphosate in it. Mr. Johnson had a form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma called T-cell lymphoma. It involved his entire skin. The medical terminology for this is cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, or mycosis fungoides. And he had a disease that was transforming to an aggressive disease. So he retained the Miller firm, and he took Monsanto to court. He's a very humble man. He actually is still alive to this point. Thankfully, I did not predict he's going to do well for that long, and I'm glad that he did. It goes to show you that physicians need to be humble and never really assume that their predictions of what the patients will do is always going to be correct. So he had this disease. It disfigured his skin. He had a lot of ulcerations all over his skin. These pictures were shown in the courtroom as evidence, and I have some of this in the book as well. And he was a groundskeeper in California. He was really spraying Ranger Pro all over the schoolyards and other things. He had a few spilling events where he actually had Ranger Pro all over his body. Despite trying to wash things off, it still really absorbed his skin. And after a couple of years of using Roundup, he started having this skin rash that eventually became non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So what he did also when he started having these lesions on his skin, he actually called Monsanto asking for clarification because he felt that maybe this was related to what he was spraying, but he never got a call back. So I think there's an element of there that even if you really don't believe in the allegations that a customer is really doing, I think one-on-one customer service is you always call the customer back, but Monsanto did not do so.
What is the minimum or maximum latency period before someone develops the disease?
This came up in pretty much every deposition, came up in a lot in court, and I don't think we know. And I think it's really important to understand that, because the minute you say there's a minimum or maximum, you almost made a binary decision that unless you were exposed for 5 years, then you're not going to get. And if you're exposed for 20, you are going to get. It doesn't work like that. We know that we don't have a good understanding what is the minimum or maximum latency period. But what we know is that the more exposure you have, the more likely that you're going to have something. The risks become higher. Look, let me give you an example just to illustrate, because that is something that always comes up about the latency period. The latency period is the period between your exposure to something until you develop a disease. So I'm going to give you an example. Hypothetically, assume somebody goes to a tanning salon and tanning beds because they want to just get bronze skin, and they do that only 2 times versus somebody who is doing it every day. assume somebody, you can't really compare both. You can't say if you only do it twice, it's okay. If you only do it, you can't do that. Mr. Johnson sprayed every single day, 5 days a week for 2 years. So he's only had 2 years technically from the first exposure, right? But he was doing it every single day. And some people may have 10 years and they do it, twice a week or twice a month. So I want to make sure that your listeners are aware that I don't personally believe there's a minimum or maximum latency period to develop a particular malignancy here, because the exposure differs between patients. We cannot really compare apples to oranges. But in principle, the more exposure and the more time that somebody continues to be exposed to something, the higher the chances of getting the illness that is associated. Why? Because you're continuing to damage the DNA and damaging the cells repeatedly, and with time, the body is unable to repair this damage, and eventually cancers could ensue. So that's really how I approach this. I don't believe, if you say it must be 10 years, then if somebody was exposed for 8 years, well, sorry, sir, it's 8 years. It's not 10 years. And we know it's 10 years. That's not how science works. It's really what Monsanto wants you to think, because they say, well, he's only exposed for 2 years. Well, duh, 2 years, but look how much exposure he got. So I don't want to, you can't really hold a particular minimum or maximum number of years or months. You have to look at every case individually and make a decision. Does this make sense? Is it really possible in this particular patient, or is it not? But every case is an individual case.
I agree. I think that it also depends upon how much product somebody is using, how
Right.
they're applying it. A farmer that's using it on crops is using a larger quantity and is also being exposed to more of the product. Whereas somebody who has a small garden, they might not use it as much, and therefore the time it's going to take before it has an impact, is greater. And EPA constantly is looking at the label. And for many, many years, it's always been the label's been the law. And people are supposed to follow the directions. But meanwhile, what's in the actual product, the fact that these products are so toxic and create so many health risks, and the fact that EPA is still not doing something about it is very disturbing. I'd like you to just spend a moment before we run out of time, just talking about, you spent a chapter about the EPA. Can you share with our listeners, where they stand at this point?
Well, the EPA, by a court order, has been asked to reevaluate the evidence. So that is good. It's a small win, and we should take that. We don't have the final report about the reevaluation. Today, the EPA contends that glyphosate is safe and it is not carcinogenic, and there's no evidence of cancer, that it causes cancer. It is safe. So that's really what the position is, but they were ordered to actually do a re-evaluation of the evidence again, with the idea that probably they did not do enough evaluation with all of the emerging evidence. So we anxiously await what the EPA is going to find out. I'm not really going to hold my breath. I think they probably say the same, which is fine. I mean, people, I guess, disagree on certain things, but the EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're really charged in this. And ultimately, if there's something alarming, the least they could do, at least say, look, there's another organization, another institution affiliated with the WHO, the World Health Organization, and they believe that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. They've actually acknowledged that. The EPA has said that in one of the reports, that this is actually has come up. Now they need to reevaluate the evidence. We see what we hear from them. But to this day, we have not heard from the EPA anything contrary to the fact that they believe Roundup and glyphosate are safe.
Thank you so much. It has been wonderful having you on the show today. And folks, the book comes out actually on the 28th. It's called Toxic Exposure, The True Story Behind the Monsanto Trials and the Search for Justice by Dr. Chadi Nabhan. Can you please just share with our listeners your podcast?
I'm also the host and the creator of the Healthcare Unfiltered podcast. tune into it. I have a lot of healthcare topics that I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for the plug, Jim.
And folks, please connect with Dr. Nabhan on social media. I'm sure he would love to hear your comments about his book. His book is based upon the truth. Nothing has been altered. He even states that in the book. And folks, that's the story. Thank you for tuning in. This has been June Stoyer. Have a great day.